Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is, well, a personality in the open source world. David Boswell, Senior Director of Community Architecture at the Linux Foundation, has got a very long career in many important companies and open source initiatives. And I'm very curious to hear about his ideas about open source. So, welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, given your long resume, I'd really like to ask you to give us a quick introduction about yourself.
Sure. So I am currently at the Linux Foundation. I am the Senior Director of Community Architecture at the Hyperledger Foundation, and that role basically involves two things. One, I talk to people about why they might want to consider getting involved in open source. Using open source is one thing, but contributing is another. So we would talk to people about why you might want to do that. And then when somebody does choose to get involved in the community, I want to make sure they're successful, right? How do you make sure that somebody who starts on their journey into an open source community gets to where they want to go and gets to become, a contributor or a maintainer or whatever it is that they want to do? And in this role, I'm not doing any development myself in this role. I work with developers, but I have a development background, and that's how I got into open source. Kind of accidentally. I was a web developer back in the 90s. And I had never really heard of open source. I guess it was a very new thing at the time. I just happened to download the Mozilla browser because I wanted to test. I had heard that Netscape, the next version of Netscape Navigator was going to be this thing called Mozilla. So I'm like, oh, let me download it to test my, the stuff I'm doing in, so I can make sure that things are compatible with the next version of Netscape. And just kind of, again, just accidentally kind of ran into the Mozilla community trying to just download the browser. And learned about open source because on their website they talked about, hey, this is who we are, this is our mission. And I was curious, so I just kind of poked around, and I loved how welcoming the community was. I loved the idea that I could connect with other people around the world who shared a similar interest, and I got hooked. And I've been involved in a variety of open source projects ever since then. I love the dynamic and the feel and the kind of the whole interactions with people around the world who care about things I care about, and so I've been hooked.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always been contributing to open source projects all my professional life. So I even ran a community for a short while. Happily, someone took that over, and I could go back to. It's not for everybody, but it's very important. So, well,
Yeah.
someone in your position certainly has an answer to the all-encompassing question: how is open source doing?
I think it's everywhere, right? I think the interesting thing about having been involved for a while is to see that it's gone from what you could call like a niche sort of area to really everywhere. And it's been interesting, even at Hyperledger, where I've been involved for just that 6 years. When I got involved, the use of Hyperledger technology was very limited to a small number of industries. We saw like healthcare and finance, for example, where the industries where we were seeing most of the adoption when I first got involved. But now it's really gone beyond that. We see telecom and climate, it's really just blossomed. It's, all sorts of different industries have been picking up at least the Hyperledger technology, but more broadly than that, I think you do see open source being picked up by all these different, parts of, all sorts of industries, which brings up an interesting challenge. You have people being introduced to open source who don't necessarily have that much familiarity with it. So a lot of what I see in my role is, how do you onboard somebody into an open source community who really doesn't have any understanding or background on what this open source thing is, right? So I think that's kind of a whole discussion point we could get into. But I think,
Yeah.
just to answer your question, I think open source is thriving.
Good. Yeah, so from my perspective, you work on larger projects, so to say. I'm most exposed to smaller libraries because I'm a developer. So there's a lot in the development world. There's a lot of one person projects, two people
Sure.
projects, smaller stuff, etc. And what it feels like to me is that contributions of smaller projects have gone down a little, but it might be
Yeah.
just my feeling.
And what would you think you talk to all sorts of people. I'm curious, what's your read on that? Why is that?
Looks like people are just just getting enough from out of that project of what they need, and then don't contribute back as much because it's
Yeah.
a lot of work to do a PR, do a pull request,
Sure.
etc. I think it doesn't help that there's. I don't want to say this the bad way. Like there's a lot more developers than used to be. So in
Yeah.
percentage wise, a lot of those are just trying to get their job done and go home, which
That
is
is fair.
which is perfectly. I mean, absolutely perfectly fair. But there's something going on with the smaller projects. I'll still will say in general, some things are doing great. Then of course, it's the usual thing of moving herd mentality. Like everybody was doing cryptography and
Yeah.
cryptocurrencies 2 years ago.
Now
Now
they're on to something
everybody
else.
and their cousin has an AI library that does something. So that's
Well,
I guess.
Well, I think
Sorry,
you're
go ahead.
right. I mean, I think there are more developers, but there are also more projects. So yeah, maybe that just means that, you have fewer, people to go around to these additional projects. Like, again, I've been involved for long enough to see, 15, 20 years ago, there weren't, that was before GitHub, there weren't millions of different open source projects. If you wanted to get involved in an open source browser or an open source operating system, there were a relatively small number of choices, right? And so it was those would just where people went. But now, I guess there's just so much more choice for somebody who is interested in using or contributing to open source to go to. And so it's harder for that person leading a project to maybe get noticed, right?
Yeah, which I think is a good jump off point from for another discussion. Because if I have an open source project, how do we make people want to be involved? Because you have to want it. Like it's open
Yeah.
sources work for free to a degree. It's not always, but in general it is. Uh, you need to make people want it, not just have to do it, which is different.
Yeah.
What So I have a new project. How do I get people involved? Because it's getting too big for one person, which is a
Yeah.
problem with a lot of the newer stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that's a lot of what we do at Hyperledger. Hyperledger is not just one thing, just to speak about Hyperledger for a minute. Hyperledger is a
Oh
collection
yeah,
of different projects. Um, so, I do think we have that dynamic as well. When people go to Hyperledger or have heard of Hyperledger, they may be thinking of one or two of the more well-known projects like Hyperledger Fabric or Hyperledger Bezier, for example. But there are, many other projects and many other labs, and we need to help those projects connect with contributors and users as well. So we see that in our own community. So I think to me, it really comes down to two things. We need to make sure that projects have what they need to be successful in terms of the tooling, but we also need to then figure out what do they need in terms of engagement to be successful, right? And I don't think it's going to be enough to only focus on here's a set of tools, go do your development and you'll be fine. We also need to help them get discovered and to help people know what they're doing and how to get involved. So a big part of our work is that engagement side. Um, and I think that's critical, right? We could talk about what engagement looks like, but I think if you don't do that engagement, you're not going to get noticed. People won't, come across what you're doing or understand, to your point, about why, somebody would want to take a closer look and get involved.
yeah. So I think you're striking a very good point. The times where I've been able to truly help an open source project, there was a way to discover what needed to be done,
Mhm.
which is a very interesting way to put it. Like if I go to, I'm a Ruby programmer, so I use a lot of Ruby to code gems libraries, and I go to the GitHub pages, look it up, read the READMEs. But very often there is not a straightforward way to find out. Hey,
Yeah.
so I'd like to help with this, and I don't have anything I need to done myself because the best way is find the bug you have and fix it
Yeah.
yourself. But that's not always the case. Like many times the library is working perfectly, but and you'd like to help or just because it's interesting to you, there's no list like what should I pick up. I remember
Yeah.
back in the day when we were that's putting a date on myself hopefully usenet and mailing lists.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
uh, you'd have a list of the top 10 things that needed to be done on any
Yeah.
project available almost everywhere.
And I think that's
So many.
critical. Yeah, I agree with you. And when I talk to somebody starting a project or wanting to connect with more contributors, I do talk to them about like what is the pathway into your project. If somebody shows up, if you don't give them that pathway, they're not going to know, right? I think to your point, if you have a list of things you want help with, be explicit and make it clear to do X, do these few steps. But I think it's interesting. I think that somewhat goes against the ethos of open source. You hear kind of one of the things I think people hear about open source when they're first getting involved is the whole scratch your own itch thing, right? Let people scratch their itch. If they have a bug, they're going to show up and fix it. But I think that's somewhat, running counter to, helping people get into the project through pathways. Not everybody necessarily has an itch to scratch, or not everybody necessarily, would know what to do if you show up. Maybe they just want to use the project and make sure it's thriving, but they don't necessarily know themselves, hey, what's going to be the most important thing to do? So I think providing some guidance is definitely worthwhile, I think, for a project to do. And I can give you an example from Hyperledger, maybe just to kind of illustrate the point. For the projects that have done that versus the projects that haven't, we had one of the very first Hyperledger projects was a project called Hyperledger Explorer, and it actually had users, and it had a set of maintainers that were doing development in the open, but not the engagement steps. And at some point, their priorities changed. They were working at companies that wanted them to focus on different things, so they needed to step away from that project. But they hadn't done that engagement piece, so they didn't have anybody to hand the project to, so we archived it. If you don't have somebody maintaining a project, that project's not, viable. But it was funny, when we did that, a bunch of the users came to us and said, hey, I was using that. And we're like, well, you weren't contributing to it, and there's no maintainers, so what did we do? And so you have to have that engagement piece. You have to help those people get into the project. And if you don't do that, people won't know you need the help, right? Those maintainers never said we needed help. And so those users didn't know that they needed to show up. But what happened is those users have now shown up and restarted that project, because it became clear to them at that point, when the project got archived, hey, you did need help after all. You just weren't asking for it.
Yeah, funnily enough, though, I feel like the modern explosion of communication tools has fragmented projects a little. Like now you can have a Discord, you can have a Slack, you can probably still have a mailing list if you try hard enough.
Oh yeah, totally.
You can have a GitHub discussion. You can have I don't even know. Like there's people in IRC who are still out there.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, and that's a challenge. Yeah, for sure.
Getting in touch with the maintainers of a project outside of the context of an issue you post on GitHub is often a challenge. Like that's the problem itself. It's harder to talk to people.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's only 9:30 my time. I've already talked to people on Slack and Discord and WhatsApp and Zoom and email. And one of those emails was somebody saying, hey, I'm trying to use one of the Hyperledger projects, and I went on Discord and asked a question, but nobody responded to me. So I think you're 100% right. I mean, we do have a Discord server as well as mailing lists, as well as lots of stuff. But that Discord server has, I don't know what the exact number of channels is, but dozens and dozens of channels. The right person might be on Discord, but you might have asked in the wrong channel, and so you just didn't make that connection.
I miss the good old days when you'd go on the Freenode channel for your project, for the project we're interested to, spend the first few hours getting thoroughly berated by the troll person. We're doing everything wrong, including existing and waking up that morning. So you did it wrong. And then somehow they just, come back and help you grumpily. What does that, like, how would you help people be successful when they try and help?
So I think understanding what they're trying to achieve, understanding what their needs are, is the first step. And again, it's interesting to understand people's motivations. Some people want more users, some people want more contributors, some people want, a variety of different things. I start there. I don't want to just assume that like I know the answer for somebody. But again, broadly speaking, our role has basically three functions. We make sure that developers have the infrastructure they need, and that changes over time. Like you said, people back in the day used IRC to communicate. Now we're using Discord. So we want to kind of constantly be evaluating what tools are available, what's going to be serving people's needs best. And that's kind of always something we need to be doing. Then we have the engagement piece, which is, again, once you get started and up and running, how do we let people know what you're doing? We've done a variety of things there. We have a very active meetup community, for example. We recently started a workshop program. We do blogs and case studies. There's a lot that we do to make sure that we want to take what you're doing and really get it out there so people are aware of it. And then I think there's a strategy piece. It's very interesting. We see that even within the Hyperledger community, there could be two people doing something very similar, but they don't necessarily know that that other person exists. So a lot of what we're doing is having a view across the community and say, hey, look, you two people over here are doing something very similar. Maybe you should consider collaborating. And they don't know about each other. I think my role and the role of the other people on the Hyperledger staff is to have that broad view, because if you're a developer, your head's down on your thing, right? You don't necessarily have time to look at what this three, other projects are doing over here, or the dozen other things over here. So, a lot of that is we will look at the community and say, hey, have you considered talking to this person? Have you considered talking to this person? And I can give some examples of that have been successful about bringing some things together. But I would think at a high level, those three pieces are all, required.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The point that you need to make sure people are not doing the same thing twice is probably truer for larger projects, but I've seen it happen even in smaller projects. Like Priswitch is, the open source telecom server is big enough that we've had two people working on the same language module, like not the same project, like two language modules coming from two sides. And the worst part is that that's very often resulted in both getting abandoned.
Yeah.
Like it's actually hard to get people to either collaborate on one or get one to finish the module and tell the other to, we're done with this. You can either help the other people or just do something else. Some people end up just not doing it. It's super weird. It is. I don't know if it's something with people wanting to be their own thing, but that's contrary to open source. I don't know what that looks like.
Well, that's interesting. So you've run across that as well in other places. I mean, I think, to give you an example from our side, and I think this is one of the benefits of open source. I don't think this is a bad thing in any way, but I think it does need to be managed, right? I mean, you want an open source community where people can identify a problem and step up and start to address it, right? And if several people are trying to address a similar problem, that's a good thing, and that's a good signal that this is a critical, important project to a wide group of people. But then again, how do you bring those things together? And in Hyperledger, I mean, just give you one example, interoperability across different ledgers is something that is important. And we've seen multiple 4 or 5 different efforts get started. And so a lot of our work has been trying to get those to combine. And we've had some success, but you're right. Some people may not want to for a variety of different reasons. You can't make somebody collaborate with somebody else, but we can certainly encourage.
Yeah, it's so let's go the opposite route. This is something that came up a couple of weeks ago with another guest, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are. How do you handle people who are misbehaving in an open source community? You see a lot of that, like from the worst part is generally when people just harass other members, especially when you're constantly asking for things like, can you fix this? Can you fix that? It's always hard for people who are getting started to channel that in positive way, if possible.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly, that's interesting to hear about that experience for that person. But I think there's a couple of things at a high level to consider. One is to be explicit about what the norms and expectations are. Hyperledger has a code of conduct to point to and say, hey, look, this is what we are expecting when people show up in the community. They behave in this certain way. That's important because I think if you're not explicit about that, it's hard to have that conversation with somebody if they have done maybe something that you don't think is appropriate. There's really nothing to point to. So I think having that code of conduct that's explicit is important, and some communities do, some communities don't. I also think having somebody who can help, explain how open source dynamics work is important for people who are getting involved in the community. So somebody just to have that conversation with somebody. Like I said before, at least, I think if you've never been involved in open source before, it's just so different. It's a different way of working
than
other development modes. The way that you might interact with other developers or other employees in a company, and kind of a top-down hierarchical company, that could work perfectly well in that scenario, but not necessarily work well in an open source community, right? You can't just show up and tell somebody to do something, but you could in a different setting, right? If you are working for a team and you're the manager, you could just go tell somebody to do something, for example, but that doesn't necessarily always translate. So just helping people understand what the open source community dynamic is, how it's different from other settings, I think that's also just important, that training piece. So I don't know if that would necessarily capture all all the situations where somebody might be, acting in an inappropriate way, but I think it's at least a starting point.
Yeah,
What
this
was your guidance for the person in that situation who had that
so
issue?
we've had someone asking for the same thing in a different GitHub ticket every day for a week.
Yeah.
And until we we got him on a call, actually, asked him if he wanted to talk to us for a minute. And it was just someone that was overwhelmed. So sometimes you just have to go figure out what's going on. Like, this guy was actually working on a project for his employer, and they had an issue with 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 FreeSwitch itself. This is a very small thing, like the just configuration thing, and he was very scared about the situation. But at the same time, his command of English wasn't super great. Like, mine
Yeah.
isn't either. I'm from Italy, so but it was so we had really like, the tickets were sounding angry just because the person didn't really know how
Yeah.
to write them up in a different way. It was just very dry, right? We need this to work because
That's
it's
great.
so sometimes you just sit down and go figure it out. Because yeah, my take is that if someone asks for something rudely one time, they might be rude. If they ask 5 or 6 times, they might have a problem. So we better ask
Yeah.
go and help them. So dismissing people doesn't work. It's part of being here, right? You picked you picked the wrong career. If you're short fuse, don't be in open source. That's the
I think that's a great example, though. But that call resolved it. I mean, that person
yeah.
understood, oh, hey, this is the right way to do it. This wasn't the right way to do it. Thanks for the guidance. It sounded like that resolved it.
As a gesture of goodwill, I just gave him a couple of configuration files that worked, and never
Yeah.
heard from him from since. By the way, but whatever, it's fine. It's
Yeah.
if you're out there, shoot me an email, tell me that stuff worked. And it was really so sometimes you just have to go and understand what's really going on. It's
Yeah.
people don't usually come ask for open source changes to a project for the sake of it. There's usually a reason
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
they're in a hurry. It's there's no point in getting angry anyways, dude.
Agreed. I think that's great. I think it's a great example. Yeah. Assume the person maybe is just not familiar with the right, way of approaching things, and try to engage with them. I think is a great advice.
Yeah, that's. I mean, if I wanted to be angry all the time, I'll go back to work at a consulting company like one of the big four. And that's better. Open source is better. Helping people is
Yeah.
far better.
I agree.
Well, I mean, that's this is a question I ask almost everybody, but it's particularly important in your case. What do you need? How people can help you? Is there anything in particular initiative you have up that you like to uh, show people, point them at?
Sorry, I apologize. I think my bandwidth is not great today. I missed the last couple of seconds.
No worries. Is there any initiatives or projects you need help for and you'd like to call out people to? Like, go look at this.
Oh, yeah. That's great. No, thanks for that question. Yeah, no, for sure. The Hyperledger, just like all open source projects, is definitely wanting people to get involved. And so if people aren't familiar with Hyperledger, I guess I kind of skipped over that in my introduction about exactly what it is. Hyperledger Foundation is part of the nonprofit Linux Foundation. The focus of Hyperledger projects are to create open source blockchain technologies, distributed ledger technology. So it's a range of different things that are going on there. Like I said earlier, it's not just one thing. We have a variety of projects. There's different platforms that you can use to build solutions, and then there's different tools, libraries, and other code that then help you use those platforms. So I kind of have referenced some of those. So you may be familiar with Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Besu. Those are platforms that people in all sorts of different industries all around the world are creating different solutions with. And then we have other tools that help you use those. So I mentioned the interoperability work that we were doing earlier. There's something project called Hyperledger Cacti that lets you have a layer between two ledgers that can then, talk to each other. So yeah, there's all sorts of things going on. So if you're interested in distributed technologies, decentralized technologies, digital identity, all those things are happening in the Hyperledger community. So go check it out. And we definitely, always looking for, new contributors, new maintainers. And if anybody has any questions about how to get involved, that's my role. You're certainly welcome to reach out to me.
So this is going off on a tangent. So I'll invite you publicists, so you have to do it. But we'll do another episode where I'd like you to go over Hyperledger itself, if that's okay with you, because it's
Sure, absolutely.
Hugely interesting project and ecosystem. And I think with AI, so this is an interesting point we'll jump up from next time. We have a discussion about AI accountability, especially as people are going to build their own LLMs, run them locally, etc. There has to be a way to tie them all together so people know they're getting correct answers. Or on the other side, there was an interesting discussion about keeping track of sources. Like, what did you use to train an LLM? And it's kind of like a supply chain, but for information. Sounds like there are two very good use cases for Hyperledger.
Yeah, no, we can certainly dive into that next time. I mean, you mentioned supply chain, and supply chain is definitely one of those areas where we see a lot of people using the technology. The technology is, kind of well suited for that. I think there's all sorts of different interesting use cases. We could, happy to come back and maybe we can bring some people from the supply chain part of the community. They actually just recently published an ebook. So we have different special interest groups within the community that are focused on driving adoption of the Hyperledger projects in different industries. The supply chain special interest group, there's a lot of activity going on there. They just published an ebook where, that could be a really interesting discussion. They could share what they've seen in the supply chain space, give some examples of what's going on. Yeah, we could certainly set that up.
Yeah, it is it's a very interesting project, and I think and that's purely me thinking about it. So like everybody else in the space, I was dabbling with cryptocurrency and blockchain and all the others. We even wrote a small project based on Hyperledger as a hobby for a friend
That's cool.
For wool fiber supply chain tracking. And it
Oh,
was, I mean, it
nice.
works. They're still using it. It's actually in use. It's a small but interesting project. But I feel like the decline in cryptocurrency interest, given it's actually made projects like Hyperledger more visible, and people understand better what their use case is, because you're no longer just trying to make money with a token, which is what everybody
For
is trying
sure.
to do. It's
I think that's a good point. I think for a lot of people, they don't necessarily realize that blockchain and decentralized, technologies are more than cryptocurrency, right? But there certainly, are all sorts of different use cases that don't involve a token at all and have all sorts of different applications beyond a cryptocurrency. Absolutely.
I've always said that cryptocurrency is probably the worst application of a distributed ledger. It's not. It is. It's like anything involving money. It makes people do the worst things.
Yeah.
Plus, it's
Yeah.
not
I
terribly.
mean,
Unless you're paranoid, it's not terribly interesting because, frankly, money works quite well. The only problem with money is usually you don't have enough. But there is no things like the government is going to take the money away from you. It cannot happen for reasons pertaining to how the world works. Like that
yeah.
government will instantly go out of business, quotes, and probably cease existing and be taken over by, I mean, in my case, the European Union or whatever. It just cannot happen. It's but distributed ledgers are very important. Like you mentioned, climate. That's going to be our number one usage for ledgers. Like, are you really offsetting the carbon output?
Absolutely. And
Really?
I was going to reference that. You're right. I mean, I think, there are certainly people who are interested in cryptocurrency use cases. But for me personally, I think when I look at what the technology is being used for, I think the carbon tracking and the carbon accounting to me, seems, fascinating because it seems like such an essential part of how we're going to address challenges like climate change, right? We need
Our
to,
main issue at the moment, in my
yeah,
opinion. Like that's the only thing that might make us go extinct. So
yeah.
yeah, probably matters. I would
In
say
this
that
tool,
matters.
yeah, in this tool, blockchain can
Yeah,
be a tool that's helpful for there. We need to understand what our carbon budget is, understand, how it's being allocated, and have a way of tracking that in a way that's trusted and transparent. And, that's what.
and that's that also my other problem with that is that extremely easy to cheat quotes on the
Yeah,
carbon output reporting. Like you can say you're doing a million things, and it's
for sure.
even hard to come check. Like if you told me you're living in the middle of Texas and you just planted 1,000 trees, sure, I'm in Europe. I'm 6,000 miles away. I don't even know if that's the case. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
we're
and you're right. That is I mean, that's a situation I think with all these supply chain use cases, right? If you're buying a bag of coffee that says it's organic, how do you know that's organic? If you're doing, anything, or like the wool example you used, how do how do you believe and how do you trust in what that, person is selling? Well, if you have the whole history of that supply chain, if you can trace it back and see it and trust that data, well, now you know. And you're right with carbon, and I've read plenty of articles recently about, carbon offsets being exactly what you just said. Well, somebody said they planted trees or
yeah.
said they offset it, but when we dug into it, they actually, it turned out they hadn't. So yeah, I think the whole having all that information on a ledger that people that you can trace yourself, it's all public, and that you can trust because the technology, you can understand that, well, this is how the information got on the ledger, and I understand that it's built in a trusted way. So yeah, I think that's absolutely a key missing piece.
Yeah, I hope that's. But I mean, cryptocurrency is unfortunately quotes coming back, so we'll probably have to go through one more wave of Bitcoin craze before it's over. Then we can finally start explaining to people why using a blockchain is a good thing for a lot of other reasons. So, well,
Yeah, and for anybody listening, yeah, if they're not familiar with the idea that, blockchain is more than cryptocurrency, yeah, check out what's going on at hyperledger.org. We have a case study library that has information about all these different use cases and different industries. And so, yeah, it's a good way to kind of learn more about what's going on.
yeah, and it's really going to be crucial. Well, there's yet another use case, and then we'll wrap up. But 5G. So 5G has a lot of distributed computers. Effectively, the 5G edge we refer to is really just every 5G cell now has a computer on it. That computer is capable of running features like even speech recognition, performing operations. How do you know that none of those cells are being tampered with?
Yeah.
So while I'm talking to you, my traffic is being funneled through a Russian spies system, and they're just listening to everything we're saying. And that's also going to be super important with that at IoT because there's going to be a lot more devices out there, not particularly smart devices, and being able to make sure there is a signature somewhere that says yes, the device is running the right firmware. So
Yeah.
assuming that firmware itself is not compromised, I'm certain the device is performing like it should. That's going to be another extremely important use case for blockchain.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is again where we see the community doing some interesting work. And if you want to have a future discussion, maybe we can invite some people from the telecom special
Oh
interest group
wow,
to talk
yeah.
about what they're doing. Um, but sure, absolutely. Just to point out a couple of things that group has done that maybe we could again dive into later. You're right about they've done a couple of research papers looking about how does blockchain work in a telecom space. One of those being specifically about IoT, and there's that particular paper was how do we take the technology that's being developed to give individuals a digital identity, because that's another big use case of blockchain. We're seeing individuals being able to create digital identities for themselves in a trusted, transparent way. But they were saying, how do we take that technology and apply it to devices? So each one of these IoT devices has a digital identity so that we can understand and track and trust and manage that on this, network. So that's a research paper. Again, if you go to the Hyperledger
Mhm.
website, we have a research section, and that the telecom group's actually done 3 different research papers looking about how to use the technology in the telecom space. All of it very interesting, I think.
Wow, yeah. Let's save that for a future conversation. It's so we have more time and we can look at things the right way. But well, thank you so much. I mean, it was super interesting, and we went through a lot of interesting topics. Again, we went through open source, how to build a community, how people should get people interested in their projects, how to handle some cases that can happen when it comes up. So, well, joining us today was David Boswell from the Linux Foundation. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And, well, rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.